Welcome to episode 66 of the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Today's topic, world building questions. How do I build a fantasy calendar? Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Okay, welcome back, and let's get right into today's topic. First thing, to understand calendars, we have to understand different types of calendars. Some are real, and some I'm going to make up. However, the thing you really have to understand what a calendar is it's just a way to divide time for humans that's useful to their culture. So there might not be something on the list here that fits for your culture. However, usually most calendars are involved in the celestial world. However, I don't believe they need to be. It could be involved around something else that's important to the culture. However, especially if it starts early in the development of the culture, it's probably going to be derived around either climate or more than likely celestial, which helps warn about climate changes or typical climate changes. Okay, so first off, there's solar calendars. Biggest thing is it's the movement of the sun, and it's the perceived movement from the planet to the sun. How often does the sun appear to revolve around the planet? Now, obviously, it's probably much like this world, where it's backwards. However, it's about the perception. So typically, a day is typically from dawn until dawn. That would be one day. So how often does it take for the sun to get in the same point of the sky as it was before? And this could be extreme. For example, if you have a planet with an oblong orbit, which means it goes really far from the sun and then comes really close and goes around the sun and goes about really far, depending on the length of, that's called the period. Now, when a planet rotates, that's it turning upon its axis one time. So one, does the planet you're on rotate? If not, one side is going to be irradiated and days would be very long, because until your planet's moved to push the sun onto that side, it's not going to see the sun. However, the days are going to last for a really long time. The sun, the heat is going to build up, and that's the thing to keep in mind for climate reasons if the planet doesn't revolve. Now, the period would be a year, and that's typically the length of the time it takes for the planet to revolve around the sun. And it's probably, depending on the mass of the planet and the distance from the sun, you could probably figure out what it should be. Arxfedian does a lot of good information on this. If you just want to make up the number and say, oh, you want a 300-day year, or you want a 290-day year, or whatever, understand that the length of time it takes you to get to the same position in the solar system, that is going to be one solar year. And a lot of societies use the solar year, even if they use lunar calendars, but that's not necessarily true. You also have lunar calendars, which talks about the moon rotating around the planet, cycle. How long does a cycle of the moon take? From new moon to old moon. Maybe it's 30 days, maybe it's 29 days, maybe it's 10 days, maybe it's 1,000 days. Maybe you have no moon. If you have no moon, you doubtfully do not have a lunar calendar. And probably many cultures do this at this point, where if you have months, you have a lunar influence on the calendar. If you have days and years, you have a solar influence on your calendar. Probably. A year could also just be every so often, every so many rotations of the moon. That would be a strictly lunar calendar. But like the Georgian calendar is both, because the months are based primarily on the rotations of the moon, and it's not quite exact, so it's not exact, so months do vary a little bit, but that's the idea, the length of time is the approximate time it takes. And we're really probably more of a solar calendar than a lunar calendar, or than a solar lunar calendar. But you could have both, where you have months that are determined by the cycles of the moon, and the sun determines the length of the year. Now, there are some calendars that actually do use other kinds of celestial bodies. I believe Egypt, for example, looked at the appearance of Venus, and they took that as the lunar significance, and or a celestial significance, and that was part of their calendar. So anything visible, especially if it's visible in a way that you can understand that there's a pattern, even if it's not necessarily a consistent pattern, like maybe every 13 years something shows up. It might not be so long that you realize it's the same thing, especially depending on its size. So anything that you can see on a consistent basis that changes, especially if it tells you something about your world, about what happens on your world. Let's say, for example, you have a moon that becomes visible. You have a comet with a very short period, and it's probably going to last forever, but it swings by in the night sky once every 4 years. And once every 4 years happens to be where the leap year falls. That's probably going to be considered important. Now, I don't know how long a comet will last if it had a short duration like that. It doesn't refreeze, and it'd be melting constantly, so it would probably go away after a period of time, but that's something you could deal with on your own. Now, outside of using celestial bodies, perhaps it's just societal things. So you don't care about the heavens, but you do know when harvest is. So harvest is probably important. Planting crops are important. And maybe you have other things that are important as well, too. For example, usually we have planting and harvesting things, which are around the spring and fall equinoxes. And that's because the earth shifts on its axis a little bit, and that's what causes 4 seasons. So since we have that tilting, we get 4 seasons. Perhaps your planet tilts more, perhaps it tilts less, perhaps there's no tilt at all, and there's constant sunlight at that same spot all the time. Usually constant sunshine the whole time would probably lean towards a very arid part of the planet. Think of this, the difference between the Mediterranean basin and the Sahara is in summertime in the northern hemisphere, we are far away from the sun. So, and we're tilted away from the sun, so we get indirect sun hitting the northern hemisphere, which in general is much more wet. The southern hemisphere, when they're in summer, they're pointed straight at the sun. So they're getting pelted. So it's much warmer and drier typically. And there are things that will change this. It doesn't get rid of rain and stuff like that. But if we shifted that around this planet where we were pointing towards the sun, you would see a lot more swaths of deserts in the northern hemisphere than you do today. Just because the sun is exceptionally powerful, even when it's cold. But once again, getting away from celestial bodies for a second, maybe it's strictly a societal breakdown. Maybe there's a certain period of time at which the race has to breed due to certain conditions, much like many animals do in nature, where a certain time of year when the food is the most abundant, or going into that season is when they mate, when the children are born is when the food is most abundant. There are many types of animals that do this. Sure, it's caused by the climate, but to the society, that would be like the baby making month, and then the baby having month, maybe. But it's really, because remember, all you're really doing is breaking down periods of time. So whether you want something celestial, which is very common on Earth, or if you want something a little different, which you'd have to explain, and is probably somehow connected into those cycles, is fine, but maybe the culture just does not recognize the moon circling causing the tides. Maybe the moon's influence isn't known or understood. But it probably is, even if it's just an anecdotal study and they don't have the measurements to back it up. After, a few hundred years and stories being told, you're going to know that if a river floods on a cycle, you're going to know that it's right after harvest. And maybe there's a celestial sign for that, maybe not. But if there is, you're probably going to adopt that in your head. Now, a strictly non-solar lunar would be a fiscal year. And a fiscal year is something relatively new. It's a made-up thing for taxes. But essentially, it's a societal thing, really. But it's this idea of we're starting the year in June instead of in January. And they do still have months and quarters. So in a way, it's still influenced by the Georgian calendar. But really, the point of it is money. We're starting the money over at this time for a new year. And that way the people who collect taxes can know what has been gained or lost and make adjustments by that depending on when the year end is for certain companies. Magic. Now, this is something I was just thinking about when I was developing this episode. I don't have any calendars like this. Maybe I'll make one this way. But maybe there's an ebb and flow of magic in your world, very similar, very cyclical. If it's especially a magically powerful world where magic is very powerful, it would be noticeable when those cycles are. They'd be recorded, and there'd potentially be calendars based off of when magic's a little bit stronger, when magic's a little bit weaker. Maybe it's connected into solar activity. Maybe it's something completely random. But it's just food for thought that it occurred to me as I was preparing this episode. Now, the basics. There are a few basics you need to know when you're building your calendar. The period of the planet, that is the length of the time it takes it to get to the same point in the solar system. And that is a year. And pretty much consistently across most calendars, that one solar year is a year. The cycle of the moons. Depending on the culture, sometimes the lunar cycle is more important than the solar cycle, and that's strictly a cultural thing. There are solar and lunar calendars early on. There are some calendars that use both the sun and the moon, and it's really just your take on your culture. If you're using a celestial calendar, what it is. And then you also want to look at, of the visible things in the celestial sky, are there other celestial cycles that are noticeable? If it's once every 722 years and the lifespan of a race is 24 days, they're never going to probably figure out that cycle. Or it would take them a lot longer to figure out that cycle, and their calendar's probably established and used before them. However, if you have a really long-lived race and they can see that 17 times in their life, maybe they do start using a very long, but they're probably going to be shorter types of celestial things. Maybe there is a small gas pocket that flares up whenever you're at a certain angle. It appears to reflect at you at a certain angle. Let's say hovering in like an asteroid belt. So you have this asteroid belt with this strange gas collection that orbits as well. And when you get a certain angle between you and the sun and this gas pocket, it reflects at you. Or maybe a giant asteroid, is just one big hunk of diamond. And so the sun hits it at the right angle, it shines right at you like a mirror. We'll say it's a diamond with a gold or silver backplate, so it really reflects just like a mirror. That would probably catch the eyes of people as you get this big bright flash, let's say once every 2 years. And depending on how significantly important it is, it might or might not get worked into the calendar. However, you want to think about your culture. If the culture finds the planets important that they can see, or maybe there's a nebula, and maybe your relationship to the nebula changes, that's visible within your night sky, unlike Earth where you need telescopes to see them. But those all could play in. Or if you want to go for a non-celestial calendar, think about what's something at a base level important to people to where they'd want to break up time. And really it's to measure the activity coming or going. And then over time, it's like if you start with a day, month, year calendar, over time, maybe centuries come about or things that are bigger buckets, but it's really more to make counting easier. Most early calendars would typically, go year 1 to 42, let's say, of King Frederick's reign, and then 1 to 15 of Queen Mara's reign. Early on, they usually don't bunch numbers like we do, where, we have it counting down to 1 and then up from 1. Or maybe there's a 0 BC. I think there might be. I don't know. It shows how little I pay attention to our calendar. But I know there's no 0 AD. But essentially, when they recreate the Georgian calendar, it counted down, and then it counts up. Supposedly from the birth of Christ. That's why it's the year of the Lord, because the Lord has been alive and been known to us since 180, or really since day 1 of year 1 of 80. But that's not important. Now, there is a website called Donjon, and if you don't want to think too much about it and you just want to put in some numbers and get some visual representation of your calendars, there's a website I'm going to link to. They have some neat generators there, especially for role players. However, the calendar could really work for anyone. Maybe you have 2 moons and they're both whenever it's a full moon is when something specific happens. Maybe there's a big night hunt every time there's a double full moon. You could track that in here. Different number of moons, different number of planets, different months, different days. It'll break your calendar down for you, generate it, and it'll even throw in random astronomical events that you can use or decide not to use in your story. But I think it adds neat detail to have people think about what's going on around them in the universe, especially when the universe is different. But how do they react when they see, I've talked about this before, but how they react when they see that shooting star. How do they react when they see a supernova. These things are going to probably cause a reaction. Comets, usually on Earth, were negative. When people saw comets, most cultures thought that was bad. However, maybe your culture does not. It's really up to you. But the thing is, when you have a calendar fixed and you understand it, and what you can do on the side is once you generate it, you can copy the data and save it in your Scrivener file. And then you can just put it back up there to look at your calendar, to generate it, so to speak. Now, one other thing to think about, calendars are not necessarily time systems. We typically think of it with hours and minutes and seconds, but you probably aren't going to have that up front. You're probably going to have it at its most base level, a day in a month, or a day, month in a year, or a day, week in a year. Some breakdown like that. Probably going to come about earlier, and you're going to start getting smaller and larger buckets of time put together when the culture considers it important to track things on that level. When your culture is predominantly about making food, like 99% of them, watches aren't that important. Minutes, hours, they're going to see when the sun comes up, when the sun goes down. That will be important. Beyond that, nothing within the day is really that important. And they're going to know when that's happening because they'll see the sun setting or rising. And vice versa, if people are trying their best to survive by getting food, they're probably not going to care that their calendar's been going on for 40,000 years. And to look at it in easier ways, they're probably not going to come up with easier ways like centuries or millennia to look at things to say this is actually the 40th millennia. They're probably not going to care much until society starts to evolve and history becomes more important. And then they'll probably do what we did, and they'll go back and they'll construct a calendar to go back as far as they think it goes, or from maybe when their country started, or some significant event. And that's also where you'll get the chance of your BC AD. Some significant event might cause people in the world to look at it. Not necessarily a religious thing, but it would have to be huge at the scale of a religious thing to probably have a calendar break down the way BC and AD do in the Georgian calendar. More than likely, once it becomes considered important, you're probably going to have something, I'd say more reasonably like the Chinese calendar, where they just start counting forward from a certain year. Maybe it's when the emperor unites the kingdoms. That's year 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And maybe they recognize there were years before that, but they're not part of the official calendar. And that might also lead to a backdrop calendar. Like, we know the culture goes back even further than this. So we're going to either extend our calendar back that far, or we're going to start counting away from when we know it for. All right. The rating for this episode is advanced. Don't necessarily need calendars. However, I think, especially if you use something like Don John, where you get this idea of random things might happen in the world that isn't part of a story, but might influence the telling of a story. Calendars can be important, elite from just a storytelling standpoint. And then you add on top of that the significance of, a new year or something like that within the story. It's things people don't often think about unless they want to have a festival. And then they'll create a festival for it. But remember, those will all be baked into your calendars. The role-playing task for the day: create a calendar for your primary culture. If you have one, create one for secondary or tertiary culture. Remember, it doesn't have to be celestial, but probably 99% of the time, especially early in the society, it will be. Once they become spacefaring, that could change. Once they become, let's say, interdimensional, maybe it will change. But, early calendars are probably going to be revolved around climate changes in connection to solar events or lunar events. The real-world task for the day: do some research on the Egyptian and the Mayan calendar. I have links to them in my show notes. Go check those out. Both have little variants different than what we're used to. The Egyptians, and the link guy didn't really explain it well, so you'll probably want to do a little bit more research, thought Venus was important. And the Mayans, I'm not really sure how to describe theirs. It's completely different than what you're used to looking at from a Western standpoint. The Chinese calendar, which you're maybe a little bit more familiar with from going to Chinese restaurants and getting that wonderful display so you can figure out that your year of the rat or year of the dog. But go check out these calendars. And then the tease for this episode is the Draken calendar. I will actually go into details of the Draken calendar, and I'll explain why I find it important. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to, and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.